Hey everybody, this is the introduction and other stuff at the beginning of the book, for the book Praxis, Marxist Criticism and Dissent in Socialist Yugoslavia by Gerson S. Sher. This book is originally from 1977. It starts with some quotes. Quote, "But if the designing of the future and the proclamation of ready-made solutions for all time is not our affair, then we realize all the more clearly that what we have to accomplish in the present. I am speaking of a ruthless criticism of all existing conditions. A ruthless criticism of all existing conditions. Ruthless in two senses. The criticism must not be afraid of its own conclusions and not of conflict with the powers that be." End quote. Marx to Ruga, September 1843. Quote, "A society without visible complaint should automatically be an object of the gravest suspicions. Either its population is obtuse or its rulers cruel tyrants or both." End quote. Barrington Moore, Jr., Reflections on the Causes of Human Misery and upon Certain Proposals to Eliminate Them. I was reading earlier today, Barrington Moore, Jr. was a friend, or Herbert Marcuse refers to Barrington Moore, Jr. as a friend. We have the table of contents. The genealogy of Praxis is the first chapter, and the headings are Yugoslavia, maybe these are chapters, I don't know. Yugoslavia, the Arrested Revolution, the, quote, struggle of opinions, and quote, the Pogletti experience, 1955 to 1960, years of reconciliation, 1960 to 1964, the birth of an institution of criticism, Praxis, a profile. 2. The critique of Marxism as ideology. And the headings are Philosophy and the Principle of Criticism, the Return to the Revolutionary Subject, Praxis and Alienation, From Marx to Stalin, the Reification of the Dialectic, the Transcendence of Philosophy, Philosophy is Praxis, ? 3. The Crisis of Politics, Political Alienation and Stalinism, Political Alienation and the Crisis of Politics, Stalinism and its Legacy. 4. The Critique of Yugoslav Socialism, the Idea of Self-Management, Self-Management between Bureaucratism and Economism, the Economic Reforms and the Emergence of a Market Society, Nationalism and the Nationalist Mystification, Toward a Closed Society? 5. The Praxis of Praxis, a Provocation, Praxis, 1964 to 1974, a Narrative History. And 6. Conclusion, the Intellectual and Social Responsibility, the Concept of a Humanist Intelligentsia, Praxis as an Institution. That's the end of the table of contents. Preface. Much of this work was written at a time when the journal Praxis was a living reality and when it was still far from clear that, within a relatively brief time, that what I was setting down could be read not only as a piece of contemporary history, but in a certain sense as a post-mortem as well. Although I initially approached my study of the Praxis group with the intent of describing and analyzing an important and in some respects unique contribution to modern Marxian theory, it gradually became clear that issue was a vital component of what now appears to be a closed chapter in Yugoslav political history, a 10-year period characterized by a degree of intense open debate without precedent in post-war Eastern Europe. 2 events better than any other marked the end of this era. The expulsion of the so-called Belgrade 8 from the University of Belgrade at the end of January 1975, followed soon after by the closing down of Praxis in mid-February 1975. These circumstances imposed on me the very sad duty of having to make certain changes in the manuscript for the sake of accuracy, such as altering verbal tenses in several instances from the present to the past. If parts of the text are still cast in the present tense, this is less a consequence of oversight than it is of my conviction that the history of the Praxis Marxist is even now still far from complete. I would like to take this brief opportunity to express my deep gratitude to the many members of the Praxis Collective who have given to me most generously of their time. patience, and friendship over the past several years. I shall always be in their debt for their help in acquainting me with important historical material of which I would otherwise have been unaware, for discussing with me many of the theoretical issues raised in the study, and for invaluable assistance in correcting some of my most serious misimpressions. In the case of a work such as this, it is of course especially important to add the usual disclaimer that any factual inaccuracies are purely my own responsibility, and that all interpretive or evaluative statements, as well as the general conceptual framework of the study itself and of individual sections, represent solely and exclusively the views of the author. It is my sincere hope, however, that by offering what I have sought to make a careful and objective analysis, I will be able to contribute toward clarifying an exceedingly complex and tragic state of affairs. I also wish to acknowledge other teachers, colleagues, and friends who have given me guidance, advice, and other kinds of intangible assistance in preparing this book. Professor Wolfgang Leonhardt of Yale University pointed me in the direction of Praxis nearly 10 years ago, an action which I can only hope he does not now regret. Professors Robert C. Tucker, Stephen F. Cohen, and Lynn T. White III of Princeton University suffered through early drafts of the manuscript and offered many sensible suggestions in terms of content, style, and organization. Without their encouragement, moreover, it is doubtful whether I would have found the determination to see this work through to publication. Susan M. Lavender cheerfully and indomitably typed through 2 drafts of the manuscript without a single audible word of protest about deadlines, afterthoughts, and my own impatience. Finally, my companion and wife, Marjorie Levin Sher, gave me obstinate encouragement, comfort, and forbearance during a time which was as trying for her as it was for me. It is to her that I lovingly dedicate this work. It's the end of the preface. Introduction. This work is devoted to an examination of the theory and practice of a group of contemporary Yugoslav intellectuals whose public life between 1964 and 1975 centered around the Marxist philosophical journal Praxis. While some of these theorists have attracted international attention as a result of the repressive actions of the Yugoslav government at Belgrade University, culminating in early 1975, there is still no thorough treatment of the philosophical and sociological significance of this group as a phenomenon of post-revolutionary socialist society. The few existing studies which have devoted only partial attention to the Praxis Marxists have, as a rule, neglected to consider the significance of their appearance as a distinct intellectual grouping, their history, the factors dividing them from other more officially, quote, acceptable, end quote, currents of Yugoslav Marxist theory, and the problems arising from the peculiar mode of, quote, philosophical, end quote, criticism which they have embraced. The present study has essentially 2 major purposes. It is based first on the premise that a clear understanding of these issues can contribute to a broader appreciation of more important political and cultural trends in modern Yugoslavia. Moreover, it is offered in the hope that an analysis of this vital school of thought may represent a positive contribution to the widespread reevaluation of Marxian theory from a democratic humanist perspective. For the Praxis Marxists are in fact Marxist heretics in a socialist country whose hallmark has been the rejection of Marxist dogma, prestigious intellectuals whose brand of outspoken criticism has put them at odds with the ruling institutions in Yugoslavia throughout the past decade. While they have considered themselves in the vanguard of the socialist intelligentsia, their history suggests parallels with intelligentsias of an earlier age who believed that it was their calling not to glorify the ruling classes through ideological mystification, but instead to expose the inadequacies of the existing order and to contribute to its transcendence by a new and better society. The history of the Praxis Marxist is, in a very important sense, part of the history of the Yugoslav Revolution. It is they, rather than its, quote, official, end quote, protagonists, who have most adequately and eloquently represented the ideals of the Yugoslav experiment to the international community and to Yugoslavia itself. Their special role has consisted in the relentless confrontation of Yugoslav practice with the socialist ideals generated by the process of social change that has continued unabated in Yugoslavia for the past 30 years. Today, crushed as a group, the Praxis Marxists find themselves in a grave situation which threatens once and for all to extinguish their brand of, quote, creative criticism, end quote, which in consonance with Marx's radical tone they have called the, quote, critique of all existing conditions, end quote. This situation itself bears tragic testimony to the abatement of revolutionary elan in modern Yugoslavia, a society increasingly absorbed by the need for stability rather than the need for change. Any further transformation, it has become clear, will be a transformation directed from above. The problem of sustaining the revolutionary urge in the post-revolutionary age was not unfamiliar to Marx. Quote, proletarian revolutions, Marx boldly asserted in the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte, quote, criticize themselves constantly, interrupt themselves continually in their own course, come back to the apparently accomplished in order to begin it afresh, deride with unmerciful thoroughness the inadequacies, weaknesses, and paltriness of their first attempts, ... End quote. Marx. 1 second. God damn it. God. Sorry. So I'm trying to get to the notes of this book. I hate endnotes like poison. Here I am. I'll keep reading and then I'll go back to the footnote. As will become evident from the history of the communist movements of the 20th century, however, Marx's faith in the capacity of the proletarian revolution for, quote, permanent revolution, and, quote, through self-criticism was ill-founded. The revolutionary theories of the 19th century became the dogmas of the 20th for much of the world. Yet just as in the history of religious doctrines, here too there would arise from time to time groups of individuals who would challenge existing orthodoxy and declare it to have been corrupted through its intimate association with ruling social institutions. That both the, quote, orthodox and the, quote, heretics, moreover, would derive their conflicting positions from the theory of Marx is one of the most significant and intriguing problems of modern intellectual history. All right. Footnote. See especially M. George Zaninovich, The Yugoslav Variation on Marx, published in Wayne S. Vucinich's edited volume Contemporary Yugoslavia, 20 Years of Socialist Experiment. Wolfgang Leonhardt, The Three Faces of Marxism, The Political Concepts of Soviet Ideology, Maoism, and Humanist Marxism, translated by Edvald Ozers. Albert W. Levy, Humanism and Politics, Studies in the Relationship of Power and Value in the Western Tradition. Oscar Grunwald's Humanism and Marxism in the Yugoslav Perspective, and Oscar Grunwald's Marxist Humanism. See also of interest is Howard L. Parsons' very brief survey, Humanistic Philosophy in Contemporary Poland and Yugoslavia. The Praxis Marxists themselves have published anthologies and individual works in the West, of which the most noteworthy are Praxis, Yugoslav Essays in Philosophy and Methodology of Social Sciences, edited by Mihailo Markovic and Gajo Petrovic. Revolutionary Praxis, Jugoslavischen Marxismus der Gegenwart, edited by Gajo Petrovic and translated by Karl Helt, published in Freiburg in 1969, and a bunch of shit. Oh no, there's some English. Jugoslavian Denkt Anders, edited by Rudi Supek and Branko Bosniak, translated by Eleanor von Steiner in Vienna, 1971. La Rivolta di Praxis, edited and translated by Giovanni Ruggieri in 1969. Gajo Petrovic, Marx in the mid-20th century. Svetozar Stojanovic, Between Ideals and Reality, A Critique of Socialism and Its Future, which is on this channel, translated by Gerson S. Sher. Mihailo Markovic, From Affluence to Praxis, published in 1974. Mihailo Markovic, The Contemporary Marx, Essays on Humanist Communism. Which contains lists and something else. And footnote. The eminent Polish philosopher Leszek Kolakowski has observed in one of his undeservedly lesser-known works that, quote, whenever heresies arrive at an organized form, it in turn becomes orthodoxy and reinforces itself in the struggle with its own heresies. This process of proliferation can go on ad infinitum, end quote. It is this dialectic of heresy, or more broadly, the dialectic of dissent, which will form the focus of my concern throughout much of the present work. For in discussions of the phenomenon of dissident thinking, it has often been forgotten that the very activity of thought is an integral part of the world of action. To say this is not necessary to make all truth relative to social interest as some traditional interpretations of Marxist doctrine would have us do, nor is it necessarily to diminish the value of the search for truths that transcend the level of everyday existence. It is rather to recognize that the specific form which dissident thinking assumes in a given historical instance may have a profound impact on its ability to persuade others and to sustain itself. It is not enough that the dissident intellectual think his dissident thoughts. He must also articulate his dissident thoughts, and the manner in which those thoughts are articulated is a matter of some consequence. The dialectic of dissent thus involves a very subtle interplay between content and form, thought and structure, which is irreducible to neat and simple formulas. The Eastern European intelligentsia has had a particularly long history of experimentation with different, quote, structures of dissent, end quote. Footnote. The term is suggested by J.P. Nettles' discussion in his essay, Ideas, Intellectuals, and Structures of Dissent, published in Philip Reif's edited volume on Intellectuals, Theoretical Studies, Case Studies. If you don't know, J.P. Nettle wrote the big biography on Rosa Luxemburg. End footnote. In the history of the Russian intelligentsia, for instance, one finds a rich variety of cultural forms designed to articulate intellectual dissent, from the informal, quote, circle, end quote, to the fully developed and organizationally bound daily paper. In the middle of the continuum was the important, quote, thick journal, end quote, whose heyday, by Robert Maguire's reckoning, lasted from 1839 to 1884, the dates of the rise and fall of the greatest of the thick journals. O tesh est venia Zabisky. Footnote. See Robert Maguire, Red Virgin Soil. End footnote. As a genre, the thick journal was dominated by prose, but at its heart was the brand of literary criticism flavored heavily with, quote, social and, quote, overtones made famous by the great Russian man of letters, Vissarion Belinsky. For many intellectuals, the thick journal became not only a center of intellectual activity, but also a crucial source of financial support, more acceptable than the crass commercialization involved in, quote, vending works of literature like pretzels or cattle, end quote. Robert McGuire. Its audience was loosely defined, consisting of a general, quote, literary public, end quote, wishing to keep current of cultural events in the capital and abroad. Each new intellectual trend would characteristically establish, quote, its own, end quote, journal with a corresponding following, and by the 1860s and 1870s, the proliferation of such journals was truly impressive. Above all, it was the journal's ability to conceal, however crudely, from the censors their, quote, social, end quote, concerns beneath the respectable veneer of, quote, culture, end quote, that enabled them to play a vital role in the formation of the Russian intelligentsia. In the words of one of the foremost contemporary authorities on the Russian intelligentsia, Martin Malia, quote, the old order in Russia was corroding, not so much at the bottom as at the top. The most important revolutionary statistics of the reign, bracket, of Nicholas I, and bracket, are not those for peasant disturbances, but those for the circulation of periodicals, end quote. Martin Malia, in Alexander Herzen and the Birth of Russian Socialism. The journal performed a similar function in the history of the South Slavic intelligentsias, which are somewhat slower to flower than the classic Russian prototype. To some extent, there was a direct line of influence from the Russian experience of radical publicism to the South Slavs, as in the case of the early Serbian agrarian socialist Svetozar Markovic, who fell under the influence of Chernyshevsky and others while in Russia, and who returned to Serbia to found a vigorous populist press. Footnote, see Woodford L. McClellan, Svetozar Markovic, and the Origins of Balkan Socialism, published in 1964. On the role of periodicals in Balkan national movements during the 19th century, see Albert B. Lord's article, Nationalism and the Muses in Balkan Slavic Literature in the Modern Period, published in Charles Yelovich and Barbara Yelovich's edited volume, The Balkans in Transition, Essays on the Development of Balkan Life and Politics Since the 18th Century. End footnote. By the mid-1920s, there had already been established in Yugoslavia a strong tradition of active publicism in which the thick journal, as in the Russian case, largely because of its ability to evade censorship through its ostensible preoccupation with general problems of culture, assumed considerable prominence. Indeed, it was not uncommon that such journals became centers of political sentiment as well as of cultural activity. Such was the case, for instance, with the Srpski Književni Glasnik, which, under the guidance of the literature-statesman Jovan Skerlic, became one of the most influential organs of the liberal movement in Serbia on the eve of the First World War. Footnote. It's a bunch of stuff in, I guess, Serbian. Yeah. But it was above all in the Yugoslav communist movement in the interwar years that the thick journal acquired lasting significance. Its membership dominated by intellectuals and students up to the beginning of the Second World War. The Communist Party of Yugoslavia experienced serious internal tensions and occasionally open ruptures as it attempted, especially in the late 1930s under the influence of Tito's leadership, to rein in the intellectuals and to establish its control over all matters of doctrinal importance. This, quote, conflict on the left, end quote, reached its culmination in 1939-40 with two events: the dramatic publication of a scathing essay entitled Dialectical Anti-Barbarous by the eminent Croatian writer Miroslav Krleža, in the journal Picat. Again, take all these pronunciations with a grain of salt, assuming you already are. And a massive rejoinder by the party in what was to be the sole issue of another thick journal, Kinjevna Zvezka. Indeed, throughout the quote, conflict on the left, end quote, the thick journal emerged as a political symbol in its own right. The publication of a new journal, of which there was a whole succession in the interwar years, came to signal the advent of a new stage in the conflict, a desire on the part of one side or the other to differentiate itself more clearly and to expound its viewpoint at greater length, the creation of a new public forum, and a recognition that previously obscure differences had grown into unbridgeable chasms. Just beneath the surface of a high-minded public debate on principles of literary criticism and philosophical interpretation raged serious political turmoil, which threatened to shake the party to its core. In this context, the founding of a new journal became an act of the greatest political significance, while the thick journal as a genre became an established mode of structuring political discourse in an ostensibly cultural form. As such, it continued to appeal to communist intellectuals well into the post-war years as a weapon which could be brought to bear in the numerous controversies, internal and external, which followed upon the victory of Tito's partisan forces and the formation of the Socialist Yugoslav state. The journal Praxis, established in 1964, is the culmination of a growing schism in the ranks of Yugoslav Marxist philosophy and an emerging confrontation between the dissident philosophers and the party, followed firmly in the tradition of the, quote, thick journals, end quote, described above. Like the line of Yugoslav journals that preceded it, Praxis, in the words of the editorial introduction to its first issue, was to be devoted to, quote, key questions of theory and society. Its founders conceived it as a forum for debate and controversy which would be committed to fostering open discussion in its pages, including, quote, not only works by Marxists, but also works of all those who are occupied with theoretical problems that concern us, end quote. It would solicit contributions not only from philosophers, but also from, quote, artists, writers, scientists, public figures, and all those who are not left indifferent by the vital questions of our time, end quote. The prime commitment of the journal would be to the idea of a socialist humanism, and especially to the creation of a theoretical groundwork for a truly socialist consciousness. But at the same time, the founders of Praxis boldly asserted that such a consciousness must be disencumbered of all traces of dogmatism and that truth must be allowed to emerge through the purifying flames of radical criticism rather than by being inscribed by the brand of political authority. By raising this unprecedented challenge to the party's ideological monopoly, the Praxis Marxists set themselves irreversibly onto a collision course with Yugoslavia's ruling political institutions. But while the ultimate collision itself may have been visible from the outset, what was perhaps most remarkable about Praxis is that for nearly 11 years it was permitted to present to the Yugoslav intellectual public a thoroughgoing critique from a Marxist standpoint, to be sure, of aspects of Yugoslav thought and practice which had never before been submitted to such intensive, continual, and open examination. Not only was Praxis unique in this respect within the Yugoslav context, while similar efforts had been made elsewhere in Eastern Europe, none enjoyed anything resembling the success of Praxis. Surely this circumstance in itself raises important questions about the Yugoslav political system, just as the history of Praxis's rise and fall reveals and reflects the many contradictory tensions to which that system has been subjected since its inception. With the founding of Praxis, the, quote, dialectic of Dissent, end quote, discussed in the preceding pages came into full play. So long as they lacked a common symbol, the dissident intellectuals who later united behind Praxis were highly vulnerable to individual attack and manipulation by the regime. Once having given symbolic and public evidence of their unity, however, their individual positions drew upon that very unity for strength and reinforcement. Yet at the same time, their journal, the, quote, structure of Dissent, end quote, which they had adopted, itself became ever more highly visible and hence vulnerable to attack. In its struggle against the ideological orthodoxy imposed by the ruling institutions in the name of Marxism, Praxis thus became nothing less than an institution of Marxist criticism, And all this is also to suggest that Praxis, by virtue of its attempt to articulate an alternative Marxist ideological framework and to offer a platform for responsible Marxist criticism, may sensibly be viewed on its own merits as a distinctive, if transitory, component of the political system of post-war Yugoslavia. Only an approach, moreover, which seeks to appreciate Praxis as a nascent counter-institution in the borderline region between culture and politics can adequately account for the persistent efforts of the party to undermine Praxis from within and without, as well as the recurring feeling of frustrated isolation that was the Praxis Marxist lot. Those directly responsible for Praxis found it necessary from time to time to re-examine the journal's orientation in response to major political developments. At all times, they took great care to define the journal's boundaries in order to preserve its integrity as a permanently theoretical organ and thereby to shield its activity of criticism from potential charges of partisan political involvement. And while, quote, politics, end quote, was something in which Praxis Marxists had fervently and repeatedly disavowed any active interest, it was by the same token true that insofar as theirs was a social institution, an institution of criticism, their adherence to that institution was a political act of the first order. This work, then, attempts to understand the Praxis Marxists and their reformulation of Marxist theory as an important phenomenon in the post-revolutionary politics of Yugoslav society. It should not be thought, however, that the significance of the Praxis group has been confined to Yugoslavia alone, for in a broader context, Praxis has represented just one branch of the general revival. In both East and West of the humanist and critical dimension of Marxist thought, within Eastern Europe, Praxis and the various gatherings it sponsored and provided, until the tragic year of 1968, an important forum for like-minded philosophers who wished to restore a, quote, human face, end quote, to the theory which was so much a part of the political framework of the countries in which they lived. Kolakowski from Poland, Kosik and Pucha from Czechoslovakia, Lukács and members of his circle in Hungary were all active members of the outer ring of the Praxis collective and maintained continuing reciprocal contacts with the core group of Yugoslav theorists. The same was true of many eminent Western European and even American Marxists like Millet, I think it's Serge Millet, Henri Lefebvre, Herbert Marcuse, Lucien Goldmann, Ernst Bloch, Erich Fromm, among others, whose intellectual contributions and moral support were highly valued by the Praxis group. Thus Praxis, through its parallel Yugoslav and international editions and its international symposia, came to represent a, quote, bridge between East and West and a landmark of Marxist humanist thought widely recognized throughout the world. So, too, the Praxis Marxists have addressed their message not to the Yugoslav audience alone, but to all the citizens of the world in the hope of a better and more humane future. And that's the end of the introduction to Praxis, Marxist Criticism and Dissent in Socialist Yugoslavia by Gerson S. Sher. Thank you so much for listening.